Thanks to everyone for coming to this research seminar, and welcome to Elisa Bellotti. Great to see you here. Elisa is going to be with us for the next 2 days, so I'll be talking about research. If anyone would like to catch up with Elisa, let me know. And we can arrange a time to meet. So Elisa is a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, part of the Mitchell Centre for Social Network Analysis. She's a lot of work in sociology and criminology, and more recently, work in health. More interested in health recently. And thanks for coming up to visit us to talk more about health. She's a mixed methods researcher, so real great experience in terms of relational influences on individuals using qualitative and quantitative and also simulation-based approaches. So I think a lot of expertise that'll be of great interest to us here in the unit. So thanks again. Elisa will talk about 30 to 40 minutes. We'll take questions at the end. We'll not be monitoring the chat live, but we will pick up the questions at the end of the presentation. So, Elisa.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mark, for inviting me. Nice to see all people around here, some old faces, not old as in age, but old as in knowledge. So thanks for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've heard a lot about Glasgow and the group of people here, so I was keen on coming to visit, and I'm glad that we managed to find the time and the topics for my visit. So as Mark said, we're going to be here for a couple of days, and I think I'm going to have a hot desk upstairs for the afternoon and then tomorrow. I know Mark has got something organized for tomorrow in terms of a group of people that we're going to see, but if anybody wants to pop up and say hi or have a chat, go for a cup of tea or a coffee, let me know. It'd be a pleasure to meet you. So what I'm presenting today is a small project actually that I've done in collaboration with Lund University and Linköping University. It was a project that was founded by Forte, which is the Swedish Research Council. And I got involved by Margarita Hayden, who was visiting the Department of Criminology at the University of Manchester at the time. Margarita is an expert in studying domestic violence. So she developed qualitative methods to collect interviews, both with victims of domestic violence, but also perpetrators of domestic violence. And she was the one, together with Malin, to come up with this idea about the role of networks in the cases of domestic violence. And Suzanne was the researcher who collected all the interviews. So I ended up working mainly with Suzanne on the empirical material. And then at the end of it, I included Dorothea Hoare, who is currently, where is she currently? UCL, but she was my PhD student at the time. So I asked her to do some analysis on the data, secondary analysis on this data. So, what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to give you a brief introduction about domestic violence and social support. I'm going to talk about the theoretical framework of this study, which is something that we had in mind at the beginning, but it changed while we were analyzing the data. So I'm going to talk about social network and social support, but mainly about this idea of ambivalence and consistency. And I don't know if I'll have the time at the end, hopefully, but this idea is challenging both at the theoretical level, but also at the level of modeling the data, okay? Because it adds a spin on the way in which we intend relationship and support. And when you use it in a qualitative and research analytics, then it's fine. You know, you can talk about it and very well. But when you try to model this type of relationships, it adds a complexity to what we normally consider egonet analysis. I'm going to talk about the data collection and how we ended up analyzing this data. I'm going to present briefly the qualitative results. That was the first type of analysis we did on the data. And then I'm going to talk about how we transform those qualitative data into quantitative data, and the models that we started doing on this type of data set. So as you can see, it's a proper mixed method study in the sense that we started with the qualitative, we ended up with the quantitative, and we're not sure about where to go next, but hopefully there will be some discussion in the end. So domestic violence is what is being termed as a hidden crime because it's highly underreported to institutions. But obviously the people around the victims are usually aware that something is happening. They might not be aware of all the details, but it's very rare that victims are in a social vacuum, or usually the networks around them are somehow aware that something is not going right. So these networks becomes quite crucial if we think about the type of support that those victims might receive, because if they can't have an institutional support because the institutions are not aware of what's happening, then the informal support coming from networks become key, and sometimes the only type of support that they can receive. However, what is important in those type of networks, and potentially we could argue in any type of support networks, is that the expectations that people have, not only that the victims have toward their network, but also the networks have toward the victim. So a victim might say, like, well, I would expect people to be there for me. And the network might say, like, well, we were there, but you didn't do what we thought it would be good for you. Which means that the literature, there is now a growing literature on the negative responses of those of this supportive network, or if not negative responses, at least the lack of support. So the network might be there, but might not provide the support that the victim needs, which extended out to this idea that maybe we should rethink the idea of support, because support is something that we link to images of encouragement and care. So it's something that is inherent in usually positive, okay? But what if it's not positive? And also, like, you know, we usually think about of support in terms of uniformly positive type of support. But in some cases, the networks have very complex reactions, and they're not just positive or negative. So then some of the scholars studying social supports, especially in cases of domestic violence, now talk about social reactions or the response networks. Okay, so how does the network respond? And to describe how social responses are perceived by the victims, we propose this idea of relational ambivalence and its counteractive consistency. So this brought me back to think about, like, what is it ambivalence? Now, I thought I came up with this incredible new concept that was very innovative. And then obviously, as you normally do in sociology, you start searching, like you Google search ambivalence, and you come out that it was there since the beginning of sociology. But probably the best description of sociological ambivalence is given by Merton. Okay, so Merton highlights the relational dimension of ambivalence. And usually he describes ambivalence in terms of the roles that people occupy. So think, for example, of a doctor or a surgeon that has to be sympathetic with the patient, but also rational and distant, so that they can inform the patient of what's going on. Or a mother that is caught in between the role of a mother and the role of an employee, and he has to juggle the two roles, which might have norms and counter norms that might clash against each other. But it's probably like the best example of this idea of ambivalence comes from the work of Elisa Bellotti. So Elisa Bellotti, I don't know if you know her, but she was one of the pioneers of social network analysis, and she studied the networks of marriage couples in London in the 1950s. What she found out was that the roles that couples have toward each other very much depend on the networks around them. So if the network is very closed and everybody knows each other, the couple tend to have very traditional roles in the family. If the network is much more sparse or organized around the two different individuals, then the couple can play much more equal roles. Okay, so Merton says, like, there's something about the role that we perform that might have ambivalence in the way in which we perform them, because we might have sets of norms that counteract each other. And Elisa Bellotti extended, said, like, well, it's not just how we perform the roles, but it's also in front of whom we perform these roles. So what is the network around us? Okay. So then this role theory has been criticized from symbolic interactionism mainly, because it seems to downplay the agency of the individuals. Okay, so it seems like although I would argue that that's not exactly the case, but the reading of Merton was like people step into a role, embrace the role, and passively do what the role says, including the counter norms. While symbolic interaction says, well, actually people interact in those roles, and by interacting, they can also innovate those roles. So they are active agents, and they can negotiate the norms of the roles that they occupy. Although what happens is that the expectation that individual experience are usually typified. So we're not completely free when we set into a role. We do something that is expected by us. So Goffman talks about the act of role performing as scripted. So it says like, well, we might change it, but to a certain extent, because usually we follow what we call social ritualization. So in order for our performance to be validated, it needs to be recognized by others around us. So if it's completely unrecognizable, then the others wouldn't accept it, okay? So if I am a teacher and I step into a classroom and I start dancing or singing or throwing things at my students, the students wouldn't accept my performance in the role. So they need to accept, while I can potentially perform or act or sing if it's relevant to what I'm teaching, and the students might buy into my innovation in the role. But when performances are not supported, then we might feel let down and conflict might arise. So why is this all important? Well, because when we look at the social network theory that focuses on social support, we see that personal networks usually offer this type of support. So we normally think family, friends, acquaintances, as people that assist the respondents, connect them to various resources, contribute to their physical and mental health. So there is plenty of literature now about how the role of social networks for our health. However, recent attention is given to the reason why people maintain relationships that are not positive. And especially two studies here are interesting. One is an Offer and Fisher study that looks at ego networks, and they find out that usually people maintain a relationship with what they define difficult people, especially if those people are family members, okay? Because there are normative and institutional constraints that make sure that we don't chase that tie. So while I can probably break a tie with a friend who is demanding and difficult, although even friendship is not completely free from social convention, it's much harder to do it from a family tie. Which means that these people have to deal with those contrasting roles and contrasting demands and expectation in those roles. But also there is other studies shows that it's not just the type of people, than, for example, family members versus friends or acquaintances, but it's also the setting where we interact with these people. So in a recent study, Mark Sorazzi shows that in highly constrained networks, we tend to see much more negative ties that we would expect by chance. And you can think about those highly constrained networks as, for example, boarding schools, because pupils are in a boarding school, they cannot interact with anyone outside, they are forced within the school, and therefore they have to deal with this negative relationship. But in the same way, you could think about the asylum, which was a study done by Goffman in psychiatric institutions, or prisons, any kind of settings where people are, or sailing vessels, any type of setting where people cannot escape, they have to face those negative ties. So in the context of domestic abuse, these difficult relationships are very common, okay? And so far they've been described as negative responses of social support. But what we're trying to do here is that we want to look at the dynamic, interactive nature of those relationships and how embedded they are in the personal networks. Okay, so we think like, okay, so we see those negative responses, but how come that they become negative? How long do they stay? How do people manage them? And do they depend from the structure of the personal networks that those victims are embedded in? So we came up with this idea of relational ambivalence and relational consistency. I'm going to talk a little bit later when we talk about the data collection and the data analysis, how we came up with this idea. So relational ambivalence, we define it as a relational dynamic in which people disattend the victim's expectations, either by providing social support when the victim is not requesting it, so it's a positive ambivalence, or by denying support when the victim is expecting it, so it's a negative ambivalence. While consistency is a relational dynamic in which people either provide support when expected or do not provide support, but they were not expected to do it, okay? So a few bits, the role expectations that we talk about here, so the victim expect people to provide or not support, might be implicitly assumed, okay? So we are not looking just at explicit requests. So the victims sometimes talk about their relationships and they say like, well, so I was in this situation and I didn't tell my mom, but I knew she knew. And therefore I was expecting that she would do something, okay? So that for us is an expectation, even if it's tacit. The ambivalence and consistency introduce the element of time in our relationship. So the relationship is not just a 1 or 0 or a minus and plus or a value, but it becomes a succession of events. And in these events, things can change. So a relationship can be positive, supportive, well, positive, consistent, and then become positive, negative, ambivalent, and then positive, ambivalent, and so on and so forth, because expectations and situations change with the dynamics of the relationships. And we argue also with the dynamic of the network around this relationship. So the ambivalent consistent relationship can also be reinforced or dismissed by the network. So for example, I might say like, well, you know, I might be a mother and say, well, I want to help my daughter, but my husband might say like, well, we've done enough now. It's her time to do something, so please withdraw. Okay, so the alters in a network don't just act individually, but especially if the network is highly connected, they might decide altogether how to behave, and therefore they might drag other people to be ambivalent or consistent. So we came up with these 4 different type of instances in a relationship of the positive consistent, the positive ambivalent, the negative consistent, and the negative ambivalent. So how did we came up with this idea? Well, first of all, we collected some interviews. Okay, so I stepped into the project that the main idea of the project was already developed. So the idea that Malin and Margarita had was that they wanted to study what happens of the personal network of victims before they decide to call the police and after they have called the police. So from their point of view, they were trying to explain what drives women, they're all women in this case, what drives women to call the police and what happens afterward, okay? So they identified 19 women who were victims of domestic violence in Sweden, and all of them were not in the violent relationship anymore, because the idea was to see what happened before and what happened after. They found mainly Swedish citizens, different age between 27 and 55, which have been in intimate relationship with abusive perpetrators between 3 months all the way up to 25 years. But also the abuse lasted very differently, from 1 week to all the way up to 18 years. 12 of these women were mothers, and for 5, the abuser was not the father of the children. And when the interview, they were all separated. Okay, so I actually don't know much about the characteristic of these women, because they were all very highly reported cases in the news in Sweden. So when they were interviewed, to guarantee their anonymity, we agreed that none of the information could be released about these women. So we have to be very careful about the details that we give about these cases. So what Suzanne then did, she did an in-depth interviews to explore the details about the victims' experiences before, during the abuse, and then after the abuse. And as a part of the interview, I designed this interview protocol that aimed at collecting personal networks before and after. So the question was like, and the question was kept very vague intentionally. So we asked like, think about the time while you were in the abusive relationship, who was there? So it wasn't like, who did you discuss it with, or who was important, or we asked just who was there, who did you perceive as being there around you? And then we asked the same question after, now think about now, who do you think is there? Okay, so the idea was to, we use the concentric circles, the interviewer mapped all these alters on the circles. The closer they are, the closer they are perceived by the interviewer. And then we asked them also to categorize them according to the roles. So if there were family or relatives, or people linked to work or the school of the children, or if there were neighbors, friends and neighbors, work and school, and family or relatives. And then we also asked for alter ties. So we end up for each of the interview, we've got two networks, the before and after. And obviously some of the people who were there before might not be there after. Some of the people who were there after might not be there before. And some people might have changed their position in the network. So we had these in-depth interviews. They were quite extensive interviews that lasted many hours. And what we did was that, so we started with the idea of support. Okay, so the idea was like, okay, who was supportive in this network? And we wanted to see who was supportive and instrumental for these women to end up calling the police. When we start analyzing the data, we basically start arguing. So like, right, this is supportive, and Suzanne was like, well, no, it's not. She said that. I was like, well, but here she said this. And we said, well, but then she says that. So we realized that our idea of support wasn't enough to explain what was going on. So that's how we came. So we could really see from these interviews that the description was very ambivalent. That people would say like, well, time one, yes, this person was there, but then something happened and they decided, they changed their mind. They were not there anymore. Then they came back, but they asked me to do this, and then I didn't do, and then they changed again. And then my father came in and told my brother not to call me anymore, and so on and so forth. So we came up with this idea, okay, maybe there is something about ambivalence here. So we used it as sensitizing concepts. So sensitizing concepts is a theoretical tool that basically is like a proto-concept. So you have this idea, you find it in the data, but it's not very clearly defined. So we went back to the literature, and we looked at all the other people who use this idea of ambivalence. And that's how we refined our concept in terms of role expectations and interactions. So then we, armed with a much better defined construct, we went back to our interviews and we reanalyzed the data. And at that point, we were looking at relational instances, okay? So what we did in any type of, we identify all the text that the victim used to describe a single relationship. And in this text, we isolate all the descriptions that could actually fit into an ambivalent or consistent description. So then our unit of analysis is not the relationship anymore, but this micro event or micro description in the relationship. And what happened, obviously, like, you know, so we did it independently. Suzanne and I did recategorize all these these relational events independently, and then we compared them across. And in most of the cases, we agreed of the definition if they were ambivalent or consistent and positive or negative. And when we disagree, we then discuss it. Why is it that we disagree? Where is it that this is our theoretical concept that doesn't work, doesn't capture what's happening? Or is it that we're missing out something in the data? Because sometimes, you know, women would describe things, but maybe it wasn't very clear what did they say. So we managed to more or less agree on all the instances that we identify, and we coded 305 relational instances. So we have 305 units of analysis, which is much better than the 19 people that we interviewed in the first place. So what we did, well, the first thing that we did was simply do a thematic analysis. Okay, so we literally, in a purely qualitative way, we just analyze all the instances in which these relationship were, these instances where these events were either ambivalent or consistent, and why they were positive or negative, and how did they change. And we found 4 themes. The first one was that the ambivalence might be in recognizing the violence. So sometimes the victim would dismiss the fact that there was violence, or the alters would dismiss the fact there was violence. So the victim might go and say, like, I've been attacked, and the people say, like, well, you know, it was just a push. Don't be such a pussy. Don't worry, nothing. Try to work it out. Why do you always have to argue? Or sometimes the network will go to the victim and say, like, something is going on, and the victim would retract and say, no, don't worry, it's only fine. I fall down the stairs, and so on and so forth. The second theme was the fact, the way in which the network or the victim define the abuser, because obviously it is an abuser, but it's also usually a father, a husband, the son of someone else, or the brother, or a sister, or a friend. So everyone has a different view, and a different view not only of the person, but also of the roles that these persons perform. And the other theme is about the roles and the responsibilities. This is the other way around. So the victims are not just victims. So they're also mothers, wives, sisters, friends, and therefore they have to manage those sometimes contradicting expectations of what they should or shouldn't do. And then the 4th theme that came out in terms of ambivalent inconsistency is how they plan the escapes. Obviously, they all managed to get out of these abusive relationships, but the path wasn't as simple as I called the police and I'm out. So there is an article that's been published. So here you find all the details about the qualitative analysis. I'm just going to give you some of the results. So, for example, in terms of recognizing the violence, what happens is that, for example, a negative ambivalent instance was in the relationship between Martina's and her mothers and fathers. So she says, like, well, my parents suspected that my partner was violent, so the parents decided to install cameras in the house. Martina wasn't happy at all about this. But then later, so she perceived it as a negative ambivalent. She said, well, I wasn't expecting them to do so. I didn't want them to do it. They did it regardless, and I wasn't happy about it. So it's a very negative perception of an ambivalent force. But then later on, the same narrative becomes positive and consistent, because she says, well, actually, now that I'm out of it, I realize how important that was. I understand why they did it and why it was so good for me. A negative consistent, for example, is Amelia's grandparents. So Amelia gets attacked. She talks to people around her, but she says, like, well, my grandparents have always been very important for me, but in this case, I couldn't talk to them because they are from a different generation. They wouldn't have understood. So I decided to keep them out. And it's a consistent relationship, because she's not expecting help. So it's a negative consistent because she doesn't receive support, but it's in line with her expectations. So negative ambivalent reactions are, for example, the ones of the sibling perpetrator siblings. So when Olivia is attacked, the siblings initially are very supportive of her, and like try to talk to the perpetrator, trying to sort things out, up to the point in which Olivia decides to go to the police, and that's when they switch and they become negative ambivalent. So they insisted on the perpetrator's right to see the children, and even swap the narrative with the police, say that she is the one neglecting the children, and so on and so forth. Or in the other case, we have Elizabeth, who feels responsible for the perpetrator and wants to stay and fix things. Okay, so that's another thing that often happens, that the woman, she put herself in the view of a carer. It's like, well, my partner has got an issue, and obviously the issue is that he's beating me up, but it's his issue, so I need to stay and make sure that he's okay. So the network around was perceived as ambivalent because at a certain point they completely withdrew. So they, at the beginning, they try to help, they try to stay around, but at a certain point they all get very scared of the situations and they try to withdraw. So she would expect them to stay, but they decide to withdraw. In some other cases, the victim, for example, in a negative consistent reaction is the one of Amelia, who she says, well, I decided not to talk to my brother or my sister, or Maya to her sister, because they know that they already had their own issues. And therefore they said, well, I can't expect them to support me when they already have their own things to do. Or Annika's sister initially was very instrumental in putting her in contact with a support network, but then she becomes negative ambivalent because when she sees that Annika is not acting upon it, then she says, oh, well, actually, you know what? She becomes angry and very sarcastic. So she starts, and well, you're not really doing anything to help yourself, are you? So then she would decide to withdraw the support. But in some cases, we have positive ambivalent reactions. So the ex-wife of the perpetrator helped Annika because Annika is living in the house with the ex-wife's children. So Annika doesn't want to move out because she's worried about the ex-wife's children staying with the perpetrator. So then suddenly the perpetrator's ex-wife, who has always been completely out of the picture, decide to step in and help Annika because obviously she's helping her children. So it's a positive and ambivalent relation. It's like, well, I wasn't expecting her. The last person I was expecting was the ex-wife, but actually she became very important. And then the last theme that we found was the pathway to escape. In some cases, it's a positive and consistent support. So for example, Ronya decides to leave the perpetrator and she asks certain people that she knows they would help her. And they gave her financial support. They organize the living arrangements. Sometimes they buy train tickets and so on and so forth. Or you could have a negative ambivalent reaction. So Nora's father wouldn't even meet her when she was with the perpetrator. And he was saying like, well, if you don't go to the police, don't even talk to me. I don't want to have anything to do with you. But then when she goes to the police, she says, well, now I've done what you wanted me to do, so I'm expecting you now to be supportive. And again, he decided not even to go to court with her. So disattending her expectations. Or a positive ambivalent reaction is Olivia's boss and her colleagues who help her change in shifts. In some other cases, one of the bosses give her an apartment where to stay or lend her a car. And those are all kind of help that the victim wasn't expecting to receive. So this was our first part of the study. We were all happy, but then obviously we start thinking okay, so what is it that cause is probably a bit strong, but that facilitate the emergence of ambivalent and consistent reactions. So we said okay, well, let's try to be a bit more systematic. So we have 305 instances and we code them, okay? So there's either 1 or 0. So an instance can be positive consistent or negative consistent and can be positive ambivalent or negative ambivalent. So we design so we convert those instances in 1 and 0s, and then we decided to fit some mixed effect logistic regression models. Okay, so when we have random effects and fixed effects, now it's a multi-level model because we assume that the alters that are named by an individual will be somehow more similar to each other than the alters named by another individual. And Mark can tell you everything about these kind of models. So I'm not going to dig into it that much. But this is where Dorothea comes in, and that's also when we start arguing because I wanted to fit some different models, but she decided to fit this one. So this is what we have for the time being. So the dependent variables become our consistent relational instances. We can be either positive or negative, or the ambivalent relational instances can be either positive or negative. And the independent variables, so what we were trying to see here is what is it that explains the ambivalent or consistent? Is it something that has to do with the characteristic of the alter? So is it, for example, that women are more consistent in their response and men are less consistent? Is it an age thing? So if you're older, maybe you are more consistent or not. Or is it the role? Like we see in the literature, is it that family member are less consistent because they might also have negative responses or so on and so forth? Or is it the characteristic of the relationship? Okay, so is it the strength of the tie? So the closer they are to me, maybe the better they know me, the more they would fulfill my expectations. One thing that was very important for us, obviously that, well, which is probably our control variable, you would say, is that if someone knew before calling the police that something was going on, then probably their reaction would be more consistent, okay? Because it's more, the request for support is more explicit. Or is it the characteristic of how embedded is alter in ego's network? So we can look at alter's efficiency and constraint, which are measurements that tells how much the people around the alter are either well embedded or sparse. Or is it a whole characteristic of the ego net? So is it the density of the ego net, the number of isolates, the size, how centralized those networks are, and so on and so forth. And then another thing that I'm not entirely sure ended up in the final model, but is the outcome of the social isolation. So what we notice in these interviews is that victims tend to get progressively more isolated. But there are different things going on here. Sometimes it's the victim herself who withdraw, so they stop calling people because they're worried, because they might be under control, the perpetrator might control their phone and so on and so forth. Sometimes it's the perpetrator that cut the victim out, for example, controlling the social media or taking the phone away or banning anyone to come into the house. And sometimes it's the network that withdraws completely, just because they start getting really, really scared or fed up. So we have a set of independent variables and our dependent variables, and Dorothea fits those models. And so first of all, she fit models that explain all the ambivalent ties, regardless of the fact they are positive or negative, and all the consistent ties. So all the ambivalent ties, we see that the ambivalence increase if people knew about the abuse before ego called the police, okay? Which to a certain extent makes sense because they know before, that creates more expectations, and the alters might, they might not act upon these expectations, okay? So the more they know, the more the expectations are high. Or the ambivalence decreases the stronger the tie with ego, and the more constrained is the alter, okay? So there are something relational that is important. So the closer is the alter to ego, the more ambivalent, the less ambivalent it is. So probably they know ego better, they know the victim better. But also there is this effect of the network around them, okay? So if everybody is connected to each other, then they're probably more in line with the reaction that they have. So then the ambivalence becomes less prominent. While consistent relationships increase, again, if the people knew about the abuse, bear in mind that we fit all these models separately. And increase in the more constrained the alter is. So then it's the other way around. So the more constrained the alter is, the less ambivalent and more consistent they are. The negative ambivalence again increase if people knew about the abuse, decrease the stronger with the ego, the more constrained the alter, but also depending on how dense the network is. The negative consistent increase if also it's family or kin. So there are probably clearer expectations from family and kin ties, and therefore, and this is also in line with what Mario Small says, that sometimes when we have problems, we tend to not talk about those problems and not to ask for support to people who are very close to us, especially family members, just because you end up worrying them too much. And the positive consistent reaction increase if people knew about the abuse before ego called the police. So we have very little results here, but they seem to tell us a bit of a story, which is going to appear in a second. Yes. So The social support, when consistent, can really help the woman to reframe the way they perceive the relationships with the abuser, and it could really convince them to go to the police. But the expectations are culturally embedded in these generalized roles. So they are embedded in family roles or in friendship roles. So a sister should be supportive, while older generation might not be expected to be supported. The other thing that comes out from our analysis is that the victim and the network needs to agree on the modalities in which support is provided. It's not just a matter of people being there. There needs to be a negotiation about how and when this support is provided. And disclosure is not a single event. So it's not that at a certain point the victims are like, you know what, let me tell you what's happening. Usually it's something that is, again, it's negotiated in interaction. So the victim doesn't want to say, but the authors perceive, the authors might ask, the victim might deny, and then the victim might say, but the authors might deny, and so on and so forth. So it's a very progressive event or dynamic in the relationship. The other thing that comes out is that obviously the women are victims, but they're also mothers, and therefore they're expected to look after the children. They're also sisters, friends, which have, and therefore they have very conflictual roles. And the women need to negotiate these role expectations and what people expect from them, not only with their relationships, but with the network as a whole. So the other thing that these women talk about a lot is what's happening in these alter-alter ties, which is beyond obviously their control. Knowing about the abuse is the most important factor because it creates those reciprocal expectations. Suddenly, when it is out there, then it's impossible not to face it. So then which is why we think it increases both the ambivalency and the consistency of the support. We see that the alter close to the victim and embedded in high constraint networks have more consistent and less ambivalent response. So what we find, what our conclusion is that the nature of ties and the structure of the personal network that play an important role in these responses rather than the characteristics of the individuals. So it's not who the people are, but how they are embedded in a network around the victim that is important and how close they are to the victim. So to conclude, so what we came out in the end was a theoretical redefinition of the concept of support. So we moved beyond the distinction between positive and negative relationship, and we proposed this idea of relational instances instead. So then some discussions started, for example, with people who use balance theory. So like, okay, so balance theory says like, you know, if you have positive relationship and negative relationships in triads, how those triads evolve over time. But obviously that assumed that a relationship is always positive or always negative. While in this case, we say like, well, what if we, instead of a whole relationship, the balance happens in the instances. So if I am in this moment, I have a negative relational instance with Mark and a positive relational instance with Mark, what is happening between the two of them, okay? And are they structurally equivalent? Or anyway, so there are some ideas that we are trying to think about in terms of what kind of modeling we could use. So which means that we need to refine the models. I'm not entirely sure that our logistic models are the best way forward. So one thing that I really would like to use is qualitative comparative analysis in these cases. I don't know if anybody's familiar with them. Some of you are, but to cut the story short, Dorothea did a whole PhD where I forced her to learn QCA because I thought it was important. So she used her for her PhD. She hated me for having to learn it. And when she finished, I said, like, well, now you have learned it, so you're going to use on my data. And she decided not to use it because she wanted to use multi-level models because she preferred the multi-level models. So we're still arguing about the fact that I think she should fit a QCA. So I think there's still some work to do on how to model this data, and I'm not particularly satisfied about what we've done so far. But one thing that I'm interested in is the portability of this idea of relational ambivalence. So does it depend? So does the ambivalence depends on the secrecy, for example? So we find similar in other similar contexts where people maintain certain secrets. So for example, think about people coming out, for example, or people with hidden behaviors like drug addicts or gamblers and things like that. So we don't know how portable this idea is. And that's all for me. So 45 minutes. Okay.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Elisa. Has anyone got any questions in the room?
Okay, that was really interesting. I was wondering on your discussion slide, you, this one. Yeah. Okay, so I know that you're not totally satisfied with the models and these are kind of just general interpretations of what you've found, but would you say that there are certain like characteristics or patterns in networks that you would suggest are most useful for facilitating women to leave abusive relationships?
You mean network structures?
Yeah, structures or characteristics of who's in the network. So I'm thinking of your last point of alters post to the victim and thinking of women who maybe have close relationships, but those are the most problematic relationships. Like, so yeah, what characteristics would you suggest for some?
So what the data seems to suggest is that networks needs to be constrained. So the constraining, from what I understand, the constraining means that the network around negotiate a response. So eventually everybody lines up and use a collective and adopt a collective response. So the victim goes to talk to someone and say, oh, you should really leave this person. The other one goes to, oh, well, but then the victim also said, well, I would leave him, but what about the children? And, you know, I tried to leave him, but then I went to work and he was there. Okay. So when they start talking to everyone in the network and the network gets together, then suddenly they can orchestrate responses. So the boss changed the shift. The sister provides a phone number for carers. The father says, I'll keep the children, I look after the children. The neighbor says, you can stay at mine tonight. Yeah, so when they start orchestrating the responses together, that seems when it's more effective.
Okay, so like your at-risk woman would be someone who's in a sparse network that's not.
Yes.
But I have this question. When you show showing the Netflix people now, actually, and also methodologically leveraging, where is the abuse in the network?
So the abuser sometimes was in the network and sometimes was not in the network. Okay.
So did you try to connect the abuser's position in the network before?
Yeah, so originally when we collected the data, some women named the abuser in the network, but bear in mind that the abuser was always there before and was never there after. Okay, so they talk about the abuser extensively, but not all of them decided to put the abuser in the network. Okay, so that created a bit of an issue because in some cases, the abuser was connected to everyone. In some other cases, we didn't know if it was connected to everyone or not. So eventually we decided to pull it out because obviously by definition, it was always there, but then we couldn't really map the position but then all the alters, so there was a discussion of, so they were telling us what the alters thought about the abuser. So it was a trickier thing, you know, we spent a lot of time discussing this, the abuser in the network, and then eventually we decided that for this type of analysis, we're gonna put it out because it was a bit difficult to deal with in the models.
One question just online, which you can read out. You said that ambivalent and consistent could both be either positive or negative. And the results, you didn't report anything in the ambivalent positive category. Was it not because it wasn't identified within the data?
Didn't I? In the model or in the,
It's in the results where they're,
yeah,
where all the,
because the positive, because Dorothea says that the positive ambivalent acted strange where nothing was significant.
yes, and quantitatively, so it was reported on in the data.
Yeah, it was reported on the data. We had instances, but somehow when we tried to fit the model, nothing came out significantly, and therefore I didn't report the results because they were not significant.
Sure, okay. Good, thanks. Mark?
Thank you very much, Elisa. Nice to see you again. And two small things. So is there any social theory in this example where you might consider tie-level covariates? So the homophily between the ego and alters, or in fact, difference in that, the gap in the ages or the gap in the on the demographics, this kind of thing.
So, well, the homophily to a certain extent, because they're all women.
Yeah, sure.
So
But
obviously if they're, you know, like we
there
can see if they're men and women, basically.
then say the difference in
The
age.
difference in age,
Does that make any sense? Or maybe
it does make sense. So what we did, I mean, in a very unscientific way,
Yeah.
we started with a lot of variables that we were thinking of. The age gap, I don't think, no, the age gap we couldn't measure because obviously like in many cases, the victim didn't exactly know how old the alters were. So we only have categories like, you know, are they below 18, 18 to 30, 30 to 50 or above 50, something like that.
Okay.
Instead of having the right age. So
So-
we couldn't calculate the difference between the victim age and the alter. Ethnicity wise, we didn't have that information. So the only one that we really have is where they live and the gender. And where they live, I think we did try to put it in a model, but because a lot of these women changed where they lived between time 1 and time 2, then it became a very complicated thing. So like, okay, well, maybe they were in the same place before, but they were not after, or they were not in the same place before, but they became, they went in the same place after.
So, and the other part was about, you asked about the random effects. And I was thinking about the research design. I thought it was really nice the way you started with the qualitative and sequenced into the quant, but you could come back to the qual after. So I'm thinking of a paper that Beth Filan and some colleagues and I did a couple of years back. And we looked at the quant first and looked at the patterns that were outside what you'd expect by chance
Yeah.
using the random effects approach with high level. And then we went to the qualitative data. So in our example, it was recovering heart patients gone home and emotional and professional support around their recovery. But it did enable you to see who was outside the pattern statistically and then go back to the qual data. So maybe it's qual in a sequence.
Right, okay,
The
yeah,
thought, really. I don't know
Yeah.
if it makes sense.
it does. It does make sense, yes. Thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah. I think you had a table that you didn't show us that had all of the results in it, but I just was curious if you included ego attributes in the model. So not just the homophily, but like were there certain characteristics of ego? So when I fit these models before, those variables don't do super well.
Well, no, we didn't, mainly because we don't have many information about ego. Because we can't have them.
The age, you can put age in and see if like younger women were more likely to, or like the baseline probability of these.
Yes, we could potentially add those in. I mean, we only have 19 cases.
Yeah.
And because obviously these are really, I mean, we could potentially put the age in, but we really have just literally the age and the gender.
On the ego characteristics, so I was quite struck by the examples of when the victim ends up going back to the perpetrator. Is that an ego characteristic? Does that seem to be linked to maybe ambivalent or switches to negative support where, say, people close in the network have invested quite a lot, say, in supporting person and felt that they'd given their support and it was coming good, and then the victim then goes back, and then that switching to
I think, yeah, I don't think that there were cases where, so there were probably just one case in which the
Right.
victim said like, right, I've got attacked, I move out. And most, all the cases, there was a lot of back and forth.
is that something that you could weave in then to the data as an ego, the number of times or the level of going back, or I just think about from the relational point of view and what the victim is doing and that impact then in the support
Yeah,
that
so
the
I
direct
think
and
that
the
is
victim
to
is
go
doing.
back to what Mark was saying. I don't think we've got enough variance there to put it in the model. Simply because, I mean, yes, I could count the number of times they went back. Bear in mind that you could also argue like, are they completely out, or, you know, they could still go back. They're out now. But I can't predict the future. So in some cases, we actually had the doubt that some of them were still there, like, still worry about him. I miss him. Should I go back? So, the only thing I could do is count a number of times went back. And yes, there is. So one thing that we saw in the narratives was that the withdrawal of the network seemed to happen very much when women kept going back. But then there is also the issue that they come back for very different reasons. So in some cases, they go back because they haven't got anywhere else to go. Some other cases, they go back because of the children. Some other cases, they go back because it's their partner. And therefore, they wanna, you know, they miss the partner. So there are many different reasons why they go back. And I think the network around react because of that. So when the children were there, for example, then the network was also there like, well, I understand why you don't leave, because you leave, but he's the father of the children, so he'll still have the right to see those children. So then what do? You leave the children alone with him in the weekends in which he can see them? Do you go back? So it's, but there wasn't really much variance there, that's the issue.
Did you calculate the random effects variation across networks? If it's
Yes,
what you are.
no, but he will probably see in the model.
It's on the screen. It's 0.42. Roughly.
3.29, 13%.
Okay.
Quite
Well,
substantial
maybe-
between person variation.
Okay. Because like if you have qualitative data and quantitative data, quite interesting, you know, the narratives you've been information about women, but there's statistically variation or like, I mean,
Mhm.
it lines up. Reading what you see in these models or similar, maybe stories are similar.
I don't think I'm following you here, so so this is the variation across the EgoNet, you
Yes.
mean, yeah, is it 30% big,
In
13?
reasonable in the social science context to say not much difference between each of the individuals and,
I guess that justify the multi-level model, no?
oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So that's why the multi-level model, and bear in mind that so in some cases, some of these models, we fit the multi-level, and in some others, there was no need, so there wasn't enough variation to fit the multi-level model.
quite very.
That's very true.
The statistician is the other one.
What is alter efficiency?
So the older efficiencies, so we take ego out of the EgoNet. So the EgoNet looked like a whole network. So for each of the alter, we calculate the efficiency of their EgoNet. So the efficiency of a network looks at how much the network looks like a star or a click. So the more it looks like a star, before, the more is efficient, as in that I mean,
Like the
it's a-
flow of information through it?
yeah, so the concept comes from Ron Barth, okay, so the idea is that if everybody is connected to everybody else, then the information is redundant. While if if the network looks like a star, then the people who are in the middle, the brokers, have more effective networks because they can monitor the flow of information.
I was just curious because Samantha and I have been arguing over one of my models like this, and I have altered degree and altered betweenness as my two effects there, and
So
I
the
might still.
Efficiency would probably highly correlate with betweenness. Not with degree. That is exactly the point, that you might have a very large network with everybody's connected to everybody else, then it's very redundant. While if you might have a large network, but if nobody's connected with everybody else, then much more. And I mean, the term efficient comes from Barth. We could argue that here is probably not the right way to describe the measure, but it's because otherwise it's for people to understand exactly what we're calculating, really.